Alright, I know what you're thinking. Another cutting board video from this guy? Well, I'll promise you one thing. This is going to be the last one for a while. A couple of months ago, I'd seen a picture of a really cool cutting board online. I knew I wanted to make this. This is comprised of a repetitive pattern with a miter joint of two different woods. So I'm going to be using cherry and mahogany. And in the middle, there's a square piece. I'm going to make that out of hard maple. And with that fancy CAD drawing on the bench, decided to start ripping up some lumber and cutting everything to size. With all the dimensional lumber flattened and planed and ripped to general size, now started the process of cutting the miter joint. I first set the table saw to 45 degrees and started testing the joints to make sure everything was pretty tight. And that was my first fatal flaw with this cutting board, was underestimating the amount of precision that you need to pull off one of these patterned cutting boards properly. You see, the patterns, unlike when you just do a straight linear board, all the tolerances stack up. And if things aren't perfect, the stuff won't glue together flat. We'll talk more about that later. With all the boards ripped to size, I start the long, arduous process of gluing everything together. I took a stab at gluing the miter joint and the inside joint at the same time. I figured the squeeze out would be a pain to clean, so I'd want to do all this in one shot. As you can see, I'm using a combination of F-clamps to put everything together and keep everything really tight together. After all the glue ups were complete, pulled the clamps off and I cleaned everything up on the edge sander and started the process of cutting these blocks of this end grain pattern, and man, was this cool. Just everything I was looking for in this pattern was coming to life. With the blocks cut to rough length, leaving them a little bit thicker so I can still run this whole board through the planer afterwards, we started gluing these edge to edge. And this is where I started to see how tolerances are starting to stack up. Not being perfectly 90 degrees, they began to bow out a little bit. So I put in a caul and clamped those in place, and that seemed to hold these fairly flat to the bar clamp. Now with all the strips of these blocks glued together, I began the process of gluing each strip together. And first I ran these on the edge sander to clean up excess glue so I could get these reasonably flat on one side when I was gluing these up on the table. And here's where I realized there's another issue with this design. And that is when you're trying to trim these off to make them nice and flat to glue to each other, if you take too much off, you're going to start exposing the miter joint. It's not that big of a deal for the inner pieces, but starts to show up on the borders. I started up with a dry fit just to check the pattern, and then just went for it. Laying out the glue, gluing up the blocks, and once again, using my packing tape covered plywood cauls on each side to hold everything really flat. Next, we're going to run this through the planer, and I know what you're thinking, end grain, but if you see my other video, you know you can do this just by gluing on sacrificial blocks on the in feed and out feed of the cutting board. So that's what you see me gluing on some poplar blocks here for. Don't worry about these, they're going to get ripped off later. And if you take really light passes in the thickness planer with these strips, you're going to see that you get a great finish ready for sanding, and you're not going to get any chip out. And it was about this time I realized that I had an issue with the cutting board, that it wasn't sitting quite flat. I was using the table saw as a surface to gauge this flatness. And to get rid of some of this, I took the low spots of this cup, marked them out with coarse grit sandpaper, and ran the belt sander pretty aggressively to try to remove it. I don't have any other means of surfacing this thing flat other than using a flattening jig with a router, but this seemed to remove enough material that I could get it flat enough and then run it through the planer and take a little bit more off and get this flat enough to sit on the surface. After ripping off the sacrificial strips of the cutting board, now on to finishing. Use a combination of belt sander and orbital sander to bring this to a nice finish. And I also broke all the edges with a router and a roundover bit. If you see my other cutting board videos, you know I like to sign my pieces, and to do this I put a custom laser engraved coin on the edge. I route these in by using an MDF jig that's pin nailed to the edge of the cutting board, and then I use an up spiral router bit with a collar that's slightly oversized hole to accommodate for the collar diameter and thickness, and this leaves just enough clearance to push the coin in place so it's a snug fit for gluing. I'm using a quick set 2-part epoxy, and I find heating these up in warm water in a bowl really sets off the reaction really quick. And I'm setting these just below the surface so I can cover them with epoxy. And of course this is always going to create air bubbles, it's not a problem. You just hit them with a torch, in this case I'm using a map torch, and all the air bubbles will come out on the surface and you get a crystal clear finish, and it looks really nice. A final finish sand, and the board is ready for finishing. You know, it didn't come out perfect. The edges got a little bit exposed with the extra trimming, but I really like how this pattern came out. You see, as the mineral oil hits the board for the first time, it really takes its third dimension with this pattern. For the finishing, I use a combination of food grade mineral oil. I always dunk that in that first just to soak it up. And then I just use a combination of walrus oil, cutting board oil, and a conditioner, polishing that to bring it to its shine. I gotta admit, this was a challenging little cutting board to make, but I really enjoyed it. Got this out of my system. I will stop making cutting board videos, and I will be on to new projects. With all that said, I hope you guys enjoyed this little project. If you did, leave me a comment below. If you don't mind liking the video, it helps a lot. And I'll see you guys in the next one. Thanks for watching.